go. Can everybody see
Yes.
the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, perfect. Well, firstly, thank you, Dino, for inviting me to speak today, and welcome everybody. I'm going to be talking about dog population management. And when I talk about dog population management, it's a very big topic. It's everything that we do when we have street dogs or dog populations around the world. Dog population management is really what we do in order to control or manage those populations. And so we'll start by asking the question of what do you think of when you see a street dog? Do you think of a dog like this or dogs like this? Wherever you happen to be, probably in Bosnia and that region of the world, there's going to be many dogs like this. These dogs are actually from the streets of Bucharest, but I would imagine they're pretty similar to the dogs that you'll see there. They're just dogs that are on the street, dogs that are living their life and existing and maybe causing a problem, maybe not causing too much of a problem. Or you might see a dog like this. You might see a dog this is a dog that's nervous, but if you're not sure what you're looking at, then this is a dog that could be perceived as aggressive. This could be a threat. This could be a dog that you're fearful of because it's chasing you down the street. This might be a dog that you're worried is going to bite you. If there's a fear of rabies, then this is the kind of dog that you're going to be looking at and going, oh my goodness, is this the one that's going to get me? Or do you think of dogs like this? Do you think of dogs with puppies, uncontrolled breeding, situations where you have many puppies on the street and people are concerned about them, worried about them, think that they're a problem? These are all things that you have to think about. Or maybe you're thinking about dogs like this. Again, street dogs rooting through trash or rubbish or making a mess of the streets or causing a nuisance. If you work for a municipality, these might be the kinds of dogs that you're getting complaints about. So all of these issues and all of these dogs exist when you have dogs on the street, and some are more or less important to different people. And so picking up on that, if we look at what are the common problems associated with dogs on the street, it's not a complete list, but this is a fairly substantial list of the kinds of things that people say about street dogs. And this is anywhere. This could be Bosnia, this could be India, this could be South America. Wherever there are street dogs, these are the kinds of problems that people associate with them. So it might be too many dogs, or it might be skinny dogs or diseased dogs. Or if there's puppies, then people might be worried that they're skinny or sick or dying. Then there's an issue of abandonment. Are these dogs being abandoned? Are they unwanted? Are people just dumping them on the streets? There might be packs of dogs and people worried about being chased by dogs, and that in turn causes them to be worried about dog bites. Are there trash bins that are being overturned and causing a nuisance, causing a mess, maybe causing a public health hazard? Rabies is obviously hugely important and a great fear when you're talking about stray dogs. Other zoonotic diseases, transferable diseases, are also a concern. Road traffic accidents or barking and noise. And then there's cruelty as well. It could be people don't like to see dogs on the street. They're worried about people being cruel to them, or they see dogs that have been treated cruelly and they don't like seeing that. Or they just worry that if there's too many dogs, then there's going to be some unpleasant people who will poison them or kick them or beat them, things like that. So these are all the problems, or many of the problems that we associate with street dogs. But here's an interesting thing. So when we talk about these dogs, when we think about street dogs, those of us that work in animal welfare, our immediate thought is to consider the dogs themselves, the welfare of the dogs themselves. And so the ones highlighted in red there are the ones that are really welfare issues for the dog. If a dog is skinny, that's a welfare issue for the dog. If it has a disease, it's a welfare issue. If puppies are dying, a welfare issue. Traffic accidents, a welfare issue. Cruelty is a welfare issue. All of the other ones, although they may have aspects of welfare, zoonotic diseases and abandonment, these are issues that are of concern to people about the dogs. And so it's an important difference to actually separate those two things. When we're talking about dog population management, we can't just go in there and think, what are we going to do to help these dogs? We also have to think about what we're going to do to help the community, the people that live with these dogs, and try and resolve some of the problems associated with these dogs. So this is a very simple diagram of where dogs come from. So in the middle here, you can see my cursor there, dogs on the street. This could be any street dog. And for dogs to get on the street, they come from two directions. You have owned dogs, and owned dogs could be abandoned, they could be lost, or they could still be owned, but they're roaming. So somebody lets them out, goes out on the street, and then they come back home. But if you're on the street, you see them on the street. Then you have the dogs born on the street. Oh, we clicked too soon there. Then we have the dogs born on the street, and they're the ones that breed on the street, end up on the street, and it's a little cycle. Now, we tend to focus on these ones down here, dogs born on the street, because when we see dogs on the street, our assumption is they're on the street, let's deal with them on the street. But that's not really what we should be thinking about. So we'll play around with that little fancy animation there. And what we're seeing now is that the dogs on the street, if they're abandoned by people. If they're lost by people. If they're allowed to roam on the street, then they, again, belong to people. And then we have the dogs that are born on the street. And so what we're seeing there is that the responsibility, the root cause of these problems mostly comes from people abandoning, losing, allowing their dogs to roam. And in different countries, the proportion is different. Some countries will see 90% of the dogs on the street that are owned in some way or are related or abandoned or lost by people, and only a small proportion that are actually born on the street. But as we'll see in a few slides' time, many of the interventions tend to focus on these dogs that are born on the street. And if we do that, then we're missing the root causes. This is another diagram. It's super, there's a lot of stuff going on here. So I'm going to try and very briefly talk about it. It's from the International Companion Animal Management Coalition that has a guidance on dog population management, and they redid the version of it last year. So what we have here is we have the house where the dog comes from. The dog came to the house either from a pet shop. This animation is going too fast. They come from the pet shop, they come from breeders, they come from a neighbor or somebody else that has dogs, and they end up in your home. Or you adopt them from a rehoming center. In the home, they're either confined and have puppies that you can then give to other people or do something with, or you let them go out on the street. And if they're out on the street, then they might get lost, they're unowned, they might be community dogs. And when you leave them, they could die, or they could end up on the street, or you might just want to send them to a rehoming center or give them to somebody else. So in the document that this is taken from, there's a greater explanation of this, but this gives you a complete picture of the dynamics of where dogs come from, where they go, where they might go, how they might get there. But you don't need to know a great deal about this right now. This is an indication of all the problems that we're talking about and just showing how complex this issue of dog population dynamics is. So let's go back to this dog and the owned and roaming and abandoned. And I've also included community dogs here because these are dogs that live on the street but still have some kind of human ownership. There are people there who will feed them and look after them. But what happens to the dogs on the street? We have the trap, neuter, release. They could be rehomed, go to a shelter, get caught and euthanized. They could be adopted from the street. They could die. They could be killed. We do all of these things. But if we do them, how do they actually address the root causes of where the dog's coming from in the first place? And the thing is, most of the time, they only address this one at the end, the dog born on the street. If we catch a dog, it doesn't stop an owner from allowing their dog to roam. If we adopt it from the street, it doesn't stop somebody else from abandoning their dog. If the dog dies on the street, still doesn't stop people getting lost. So we're trying to address these problems here with dogs born on the street, but we're ignoring where the dogs are coming from in the first place. And this little animation kind of shows what we end up doing in dog population management. We have a leaky boat and all the dogs are pouring in, and what we're trying to do is just keep ourselves afloat by trap, neuter, release, or doing little bits of work here and there without what we should be doing there is finding a cork or finding a plug and stopping that flow of dogs coming in the first place. But what we tend to do is deal with the symptoms rather than dealing with the root causes. And so there's a common myth with street dogs in that most dogs on the street are unowned. We think we see a dog on the street and it doesn't belong to anybody. The fact is, most dogs, or at least a high proportion of dogs, and it depends on which country you're in, have some form of guardianship. That could be an owner, or it could be just somebody looking out for it, feeding it, making, allowing it to sleep in a shelter in their yard or something like that. And we have these tools that we focus on with dog population management. And these are the key things that we do. It's a checklist of different tools that we can use. Legislation, we can have laws in place and enforcement to make sure that dogs are looked after correctly. We could have education, going into schools or teaching about responsible pet ownership. We have registration and identification. It could be microchips or collars or tags so that we can work out which dog is with which person. We have the holding facilities and shelters and rehoming centers to deal with dogs. We take them off the street, we take them there, we try to find them a different home. We have sterilization and contraception. Contraception is a newer thing. It's not really that common a practice, but sterilization, trap, neuter, and releasing dogs back on the street so they can't have puppies anymore. We have vaccination and parasite control to deal with issues of rabies and zoonosis. Euthanasia in some cases. Sometimes a dog is on the street and for health reasons or for behavior reasons, we might just have to humanely euthanize it. And then lastly, we have controlling access to resources. Having food on the street, having too much trash on the street is something that is going to help support a dog population. And so how do we address the root causes? We have that list of tools there, but how do we address those root causes? And the fact is there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to assess and measure and use an assessment and measurement-based approach. We need to look at each situation and work out, why is this different here? What does the dog population look like in this country, in this city, in this town? What proportion of the dogs are owned or unowned? We need to look at all of those kinds of things. And we need to be able to monitor and evaluate, because there's no point in just going in there and trying to deal with the stray dogs. We need to know if we're doing it right or wrong, or what improvements are being made, or what mistakes we've made. And human behavior is at the root cause of most animal welfare problems. So as well as just dealing with the dogs on the street, by sterilizing them or vaccinating them, we need to understand the attitudes and the behaviors of the people that live in those communities so that they understand, so that we can understand what we need to do to make sure that we're dealing with responsible ownership, that we're dealing with things like abandonment or issues where people don't know how to deal with dogs on the street, reducing the number of dog bites or things like that. So this is another infographic. And so a few slides ago, you saw this. This was the list of tools that you need. And these are all correct, but you don't just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You have to pick the right ones to use, and they're going to be different in each situation. And in some places, if you don't have legislation, that might be the thing that you need to focus on first. Or sterilization might need to be the thing that you focus on the most, because there's a lot of dogs. But it doesn't mean you just focus on one thing. You have to work out which proportion of each of these things is going to have the biggest effect based on the no one size fits all solution and understanding each situation. And so there are some things that are a foundation. They're essential. If you're going to deal with dogs, then you need legislation. You need a task force. You need a group of people who are going to deal with it. Could be municipalities, could be government, could be local animal welfare groups. You need advocacy. So you need the community on your side. You need people to know about what you're doing and be engaged with it. And then you have to do all of these things. Then you have to pick and choose which ones you're going to focus on. Are you going to focus on identification? Are you going to focus on the control of breeding or the management of resources? Or what else do you need? Do you need shelters or holding facilities or an education program? And then what are you going to do with the other things? Are you going to see whether you have access to reproduction control or local capacity is lacking? These are all the things that you need in order to use all of those tools effectively. And again, this is something that's on the ICAM website, and I'll provide a link for that as well. So if we know we need to know a lot of things, what are the things that we need to know? And we can divide those up into 3 different categories. The first one is dogs. So what do we need? What are some of the things that we might need to know about dogs? If we're going into a community and we want to have an effective project that's going to make an impact, what kind of things do we need to know? Well, first of all, obviously, we need to know the number of dogs on the street. We need to know how many we're dealing with, not just because it's important or we like numbers, but because we need a budget. If we're going to sterilize dogs, are we sterilizing 100 or are we sterilizing 1,000? Because that's a big difference. And also we need to know from the number of dogs, proportionally the impact we're going to have. I apologize about there's something going on with my presentation, and it's automatically after a few seconds running through onto the next slide. So I'm having to skip back and so I'm just working around that. So I apologize if that's confusing for people. But the number of dogs on the street there, we also need to know when we're monitoring and evaluating. If we decide we want to sterilize dogs, say you have a population of 1,000 dogs and you sterilize 100, well, that's 10% of the population. But if you have a population of 10,000 dogs and you sterilize 100, well, then that's 1% of the population. And so you have to work out, is that actually a good use of your time to only impact 1% of the population when education or vaccinations or flea treatments might be a better way of using the limited source of money that you have? You also need to look at the dynamics of the population. Are they owned? Are they stray? Because if they're actually born on the street, if the majority of dogs or a large proportion are born on the street, well, then sterilization is important. But that would be trap, neuter, and release. But if the proportion is owned, if a large proportion is owned, well, then you might want to look at responsible pet ownership or still do sterilization, but then it's the owner's responsibility. They should be maybe bringing their dogs to a veterinary clinic. And you also need to look at the age and the sex and the number of puppies that are on population. Then you want to look at the resource access. What keeps the dogs alive and reproducing? Is there a lot of trash on the street? Are people feeding them? What is it that's keeping this population healthy and breeding or unhealthy and breeding? And as I said before, you need to know the size of the owned population. Are 60% of the dogs owned or are 10% of the dogs owned? Because that's important. Then we look at public attitude. So you need to know what people's attitudes are towards the stray dogs and towards their own dogs. People might love their own dog, but they might hate to see the dogs on the street. And if you're going to address the dogs on the street, if people don't like them, then you're going to have a hard time convincing people to support what it is that you want to do. And in order to understand their attitudes, you need to know what their concerns are. Is it rabies? Is it bites? Is it barking? Is it breeding? Is it nuisance? Could be all of those things. Then we need to understand pet ownership and what are their attitudes towards it? Do people care about vaccinating their dog or sterilizing them or controlling reproduction? Do they think it's okay to drown puppies if they don't want them anymore? Because all of this will tell you a lot about the kind of education that you need or the kind of legislation that you need to put in place. Do people even want dogs on the street? Or do people want dogs killed on the street? If people live in a place and there's poisoning or shooting or things like that, does that bother people? Is that more important that that's resolved? Or is it more important that people don't want dogs on the street? Or will they tolerate them? Do people tolerate roaming dogs if they're safe and healthy, but not aggressive? And so again, we need to ask people what it is that they would put up with, because we might not be able to solve all of the problems. And there's a difference between attitudes and behaviors. So what people think about or what people want to do about the dogs and what people actually do are sometimes very different. So why do people own dogs? Do they have them as pets, as companions, as guard dogs, as hunting dogs? You need to know what their purpose is, because again, that gives you an idea of how you address some of the issues. And then how do people treat their own dogs? Do they chain them up outside? Do they keep them indoors? Do they allow them to go out on the streets? Do they let their dogs roam? And then what do they do with unwanted puppies when a dog gets pregnant? As I said before, do they drown them? Do they give them to friends? Do they sell them? Do they give them to shelters? Do they just let them go on the street? All of these things are things you need to know about their behaviors. And as I said, sometimes what people say they will do and what they actually do are very different. And then we need to know what the most common issues are that people can't cope with, similar to the attitudes, but again, their behaviors. Causing abandonment. Is it disease? Is it behavior? Is it money? Is it the age of the dog? What causes a person to abandon their dog? Because again, if we want to stop abandonment, if we want to stop the issue with root causes, then we need to know what those root causes are in the first place and know how to deal with them. And then lastly, I mentioned it a couple of times, but this is the International Companion Animal Management Humane Dog Population Management Guidance. This was updated at the end of last year. The first edition has been around since 2007, but this version is terrific. It goes into a great deal more detail about all of the kinds of things that we've talked about, looking at the different tools, legislation and enforcement and sterilization. And it also talks about all of the other things like those infographics that I showed you, and gives a whole bunch of case studies from around the world looking at how different countries, different communities, different governments have taken these tools and made them work. So it's a really useful resource to get all of the information that you need. And the ICAM website also is very, very helpful because it's got a lot of downloadable tools and information. And with that, that was a lot of information to get through. I hope it was interesting and useful to some of you, all of you. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm quite happy to answer any questions now if you have them.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very informative. We do have a few questions, and again, if some of them are too broad, you can choose to skip them, and then we can send them to you via email.
Sure.
So let's get to it. In order to affect the size of a dog population, what proportion of the population needs to be sterilized and over what time period?
That's a very, very good question, because that not only relates to the size of the population, but also the impact that you're going to have. And that ties in sometimes to rabies vaccination. So the rule of thumb, most people will say 70%. To have a greater enough impact that you can then control and eventually reduce a dog population, it needs to be 70%. But some projects now are seeing that as needing to be a little higher, maybe 80 or even 90%. And it depends on a number of factors. It depends on the carrying capacity of the area, so the resources that are available for those dogs. If there's plentiful food, if there's lots of shelter, if there's lots of opportunities for the dogs to live an active, healthy life, well, then they're going to breed better and the puppies are going to have a higher survival rate. If there's less food available, then even though there's breeding, there's going to be less puppies surviving. As a rule of thumb, I would say 70%. If you want to have an impact on a dog population, you need to be aiming for 70%. Now, the second part of that question was over what time period? And that's the real million-dollar question. If you've got a town that has 100 dogs, then potentially within a month, you could sterilize 70 of those dogs, and there you go, you've hit your 70%. If you're working in a city that's got 10 or 20,000 dogs in it, then trying to get 7 or 14,000 dogs sterilized in one perhaps breeding season is going to be very difficult. So really what you need to do is, the higher the number of the entire dog population in the area that you're looking at, say it's a city, then you break that city down into manageable chunks. You break it down into neighborhoods where there is a group of dogs that maybe are in that territory, and then you move from place to place. So you try and break it down so it's a manageable chunk. If there's this neighborhood that's got 100 dogs in it, focus on that neighborhood. Get 70, 80, 90% of those dogs sterilized, and then move on to the next neighborhood. But think about it systematically, working your way through. The easiest thing to do is try and work with local vets as well. A lot of animal welfare organizations try and take the burden on themselves, try and solve these problems themselves. Really, the best way of dealing with this is making everybody realize that it's a community issue and that the municipality needs to be involved, local vets need to be involved. Everybody needs to be working together to try and resolve this. It's not just about you going out on the street and sterilizing 70% of the dogs as an organization. You need to get owners to sterilize their dogs as well, so that they're the ones that you then don't have to worry about. So it's all of these things. There's no simple answer, but there's some kind of rules of thumb and processes to go through. I hope that kind of answers that question a little bit.
Thank you, Harry. We have a couple more.
Sure.
Sorry. What are the effects of one-off intermittent sterilization in comparison to consistent programs in an area?
Very, very good question. Historically, that helicoptering in, sterilizing a huge number of dogs in a 2-week sterilization campaign and then coming out again was kind of a way many organizations did it in the past. There are, for the welfare of dogs, there's clearly advantages in doing that. If you look at it from the absolute dog level, those dogs that are sterilized are less likely to have issues related with pregnancy and mating and dog fighting, and there's a reduction in certain cancers and diseases that they might have a propensity for if they're unsterilized. So from a welfare perspective, there is an advantage to going in there. But if you're talking about it from a wider population impact, if you go in there and, again, let's take an imaginary town with 1,000 dogs, and you go in there for a couple of weeks and you sterilize 100 dogs, but you can't come back for a year. Well, in a year's time, that 100 dogs you sterilized is going to have made virtually no difference to that overall population. And that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile, and it doesn't mean you haven't helped those 100 dogs. You just have to be realistic about your expectations of what you want to achieve. You can't go in there sterilizing 10% of the dogs and think you're going to have a big impact on the population. But if you want to, as a project, just sterilize 100 dogs for the welfare of those dogs, then that's fine. But there are probably better, more effective tools that you can use if you're limited to going in for a week. But really, if you're looking at dog population management, it has to be systematic. It can't be a dive in and dive out. And that's why working with the community is so important, because you need the whole community behind this. If you step away, somebody's got to be there to take it over and make sure that it ticks along. Could be the local vets, could be the municipality. In an ideal world, you want this to be an ongoing thing rather than just a dive in and dive out.
Okay. Thank you. Let's have a few more. What measures are best to take to cut out the human factor for production of street dogs?
Oh, wow. Good question. What are the best measures to take? If we're talking about the human factor, it goes back to what we were talking about, where the dogs come from. So they are either abandoned or lost or roaming. We're not going to talk about community dogs because it's kind of less of a thing in most places. But if we look at those three factors, and we can put, like, lost dogs is probably the smallest category. Like, somebody loses a dog, if they don't look for it, then that probably tells you that they didn't really care about that dog in the first place, and they're just going to maybe they're somebody that lives in a rural area and they've got a bunch of dogs, and if one runs away, well, it doesn't matter because they've got 12 more anyway. So that's a dog getting lost. Abandonment is where, for some reason, they actively can't look after the dog anymore, don't want to look after the dog anymore. Could be because they're moving, could be because financial issues, could be just because the dog's behavior, bunch of different reasons why people would just give up a dog. And if they put it out on the street, then hopefully somebody's going to look after it. There's other dogs on the street, so it'll probably be all right. And then, but usually the biggest issue is owned roaming dogs. And this is the one that people tend to forget, is in communities where people just let their dog that's owned wander around. And they're the ones that are breeding with other dogs, having puppies. And that can be as much as 80% of the dog population is owned roaming in some parts of the world. On average, it's kind of 50-50, but in some places it could be as much as 80%. The common thing with all of those things, as was suggested by the question, is people. So what do you do? What do you do? And that's where we talk about concepts of changing human attitudes and behaviors. And education is something that people often talk about. Oh, let's just hold an education seminar and teach people how to be responsible owners. But then that actually causes a bit of a problem, because if you ask somebody who lets their dog roam, are you a responsible owner? They're not going to go, no, I'm a terrible owner. I don't know anything about dogs. What they're going to say is, yeah, of course I am. I know about dogs. I've always had dogs. So you can't just go in there presuming to know how to tell people what to do with their dogs. You have to understand the community a bit better. And there's a huge range of tools that can be used. I mean, I barely even touched on them here in this presentation. There's a huge range of tools of how to reach different elements of the community. But you have to know your audience. Are you talking about somebody who lives in a rural area and just doesn't care about their dogs, or somebody that wants to care about their dogs that is having financial issues? Again, it's understanding the different people, and it's working out the right tools to use. But if you go onto the ICANN website, or another website called Human Behavior Change for Animals, which is another organization that I advise for, they look at it from the human side. So their focus is very much, how do you deal with people? Because people are the root cause of the problem. So what do we do to deal with the people? And so again, I can put both of those links up and people can visit both of those websites, and hopefully they'll have a lot of tools and resources and answers that go into more detail there.
Thank you, Harry. We have 3 more questions. Let's have one more, and then maybe you can tell us a bit about the podcast that you're running. Is that okay? Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's have one more. Is having a shelter or a rehoming center an essential factor for successful dog population management?
I would almost say the opposite, in that it's probably the least essential factor in a dog population management project. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Shelters tend to get used because they're something that you associate with unwanted dogs. It's a default position to go for. There's dogs on the street. They're not being looked after correctly. Let's take them off the street where they're at risk, and we put them in a shelter. And then we can look after them and try and find them homes. But if you are in a place where rehoming from a shelter isn't really a thing, then you are going to have very low turnover. And if you build a shelter that houses 200 dogs, then very quickly you're going to find that you have 200 dogs. And so what do you do then when the 201st dog turns up, or the 202nd dog? It's very, very easy for shelters to become overwhelmed and overpopulate, because it's just one more dog becomes 10 more dogs, becomes 50 more dogs. And each one of those dogs costs money, costs time, costs effort to look after. And yes, shelters can help those dogs if it's a well-run shelter, if there is a good turnover, if they can find them homes. But sometimes it's better for the dogs if there is a well-managed and engaged community that is looking out for those dogs. Sometimes it's better for them to remain on the street. If there's shelter, if there's regular food, if there's veterinary care and attention, if they're not going to be treated cruelly by people, it might be better for those dogs to remain on the street. And if you have a certain amount of money, if you have a budget of, I don't know, $10,000 or euros or whatever it is, you could use all of that money on a shelter and have a very minimal impact on the dogs on the street. Or you could use that money for sterilization and community engagement and vaccination and reach 10 times the number of dogs. So again, it's understanding what it is that you want to actually achieve. A shelter potentially can have a place, but I would always approach it very, very carefully, because it is a big drain on resources. And unless you've gone through that process of assessing the situation where you actually are, you shouldn't go in there just thinking that a shelter is the first thing you should do. It might be a tool, but it might not. And you need to go into a situation with a very, very open mind, being aware of all the pitfalls that a shelter can actually cause. Dino has disappeared. Where's he gone? Dino has vanished. Looks like there's some technical issues. I don't know if Dino has had some problems. Yes. Guess probably just need to wait and see. Can everyone still hear me if I'm talking? If somebody can just message in the comments.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Dino asked me to mention the podcast. So I have a podcast as well. It's called the Animal Chat podcast. You can find it on any podcast platform, but I'll put some links in the comments here as well. And it's only been going for a month, but we speak to different people in the animal welfare world. So everything from dogs and cats to wild animals to vegetarianism and veganism, anything to do with animal welfare. We have different guests on every week. And the first 3 are available now. The first one is just myself and my co-host Matt talking about what it's like to work in animal welfare and our journey in animal welfare. The second one is with somebody called Tim Harrison, who used to be a police officer and animal rescuer in Ohio in the United States. And he was actually the subject of a film called The Elephant in the Living Room. And we talked about wild animal ownership as pets in the United States. And it's kind of linked to, if any of you have watched Tiger King on Netflix recently, it's that whole world and that whole situation. And we also have Lola Weber, who is one of my colleagues and one of the co-founders of Change for Animals Foundation. And she works on the dog meat trade in Southeast Asia. And so we were talking to her about that last week. And then this week, we actually have a couple from Sri Lanka who run one of the best dog population management projects in the world. And so that'll be coming out this Friday. As I said, I'll put the link in into the comments section so everybody can access it.
Harry, sorry, my connection broke. We're working from home and my Wi-Fi gave up on me. Sorry about that.
We managed to wing it. There was an awkward pause for a minute, and then I just rambled on about my podcast.
Thank you. Sorry again. It's the connection here in Bosnia is horrible. So I apologize.
No problem at all.
Okay, great. Harry, again, thank you very much. I think you've answered and covered all of the questions that we had. There's 2 more that I didn't cover, but I didn't want to take too much time. So I'll send them to you via email if that's okay.
Absolutely. I'm just going to put the links to the websites that I mentioned in the comment section so people can access them all.
Please do. Since this is being recorded, I'm going to have all of these links and questions that you wrote into the chat. So I'll send them to everyone as well.
Perfect.
Okay, Harry, again, thank you very much. Thank you for the informative presentation, and thank you for taking out the time to present for us, to you and Alistair as well.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Let me just wrap this up very quickly in the local language, and then I'll speak to you soon.
Of course.
Thanks, Harry. Dragi svi, evo ja se izvinjavam još jednom zbog ovog kratkog prekida, nešto sam imao problema sa internetom. Sva vaša pitanja koja nisu odgovorena mi ćemo poslati našim kolegama putem maila. Čim nam odgovore, dobit ćete svi zajedno sa linkom za ovaj webinar koji smo snimali. Još jednom hvala vam puno na izdvojenom vremenu i svako dobro želim.